The flames took everything from Natalie Morgan in the span of an hour, reducing her schoolhouse and the small cabin beside it to ash and memory on a bitter February morning in 1876. She stood in the cold dawn light, wrapped in a borrowed blanket that smelled of horses and smoke, watching the last embers die in what had been her home for 3 years. The children of Eureka Springs, Arkansas had been her purpose, her joy, and now the building where she had taught them their letters and numbers was nothing but blackened timber and shattered glass. Her trunk of books, her mother's china teacups, the photograph of her parents, the carefully saved wages from her teaching salary, all of it gone. "Miss Morgan, you cannot stay here." Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Come to our home. We will find you a place to rest." But Natalie could only shake her head, her eyes fixed on the ruin. The fire had started sometime in the night. No one knew how. She had woken to the smell of smoke, barely escaping in her nightgown before the roof collapsed. Now, at 23 years old, she owned nothing but that nightgown and the blanket around her shoulders. The town gathered as morning broke fully over the Ozark Hills. Eureka Springs was a small community, carved into the limestone bluffs and valleys, known for its healing springs and the rough men who came seeking fortunes in the surrounding wilderness. It was not a wealthy town, but it had heart. The people who came to stand beside Natalie proved that. "We will rebuild," Mayor Hendricks announced, his voice carrying across the crowd. "The children need their school. Miss Morgan needs a home." But Natalie heard the uncertainty beneath his words. The town had just built a new church. The winter had been hard. Money was scarce, and charity had limits. She spent that first night in the Patterson home, lying awake in their guest room, staring at the ceiling. Everything she had worked for since coming west from Boston 3 years ago was gone. Her independence, her security, her purpose, all reduced to ash. The weight of it pressed against her chest until she could barely breathe. The next morning, she dressed in a borrowed dress that hung too loose on her slender frame and made her way back to the ruins. She did not know what she hoped to find. Perhaps some small thing that had survived, some token of her former life. But there was nothing. Even the school bell, which had hung proudly above the door, had melted in the heat. She was standing there, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold wind, when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. She turned to see a man she recognized but had never spoken to, sitting atop a flatbed loaded with lumber. Dalton Zimmerman was known in Eureka Springs as the quiet cowboy who kept to himself. He had a small ranch about 5 miles outside of town, where he raised cattle and horses. He came to town only for supplies, speaking to no one unless absolutely necessary. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of storm clouds. Natalie guessed him to be about 28 or 29. She had seen him perhaps a dozen times in her 3 years here, always on the periphery, always alone. He pulled the wagon to a stop beside the ruins and climbed down without a word. For a long moment he stood looking at the destruction, his hat in his hands. Then he looked at her. "I brought lumber," he said. His voice was low and rough, as if he did not use it often. "Thought we could start with a frame. Get the walls up before the next snow." Natalie stared at him. "I do not understand. For the school." He turned back to the wagon, began pulling off boards. "Town needs a school. Children need a teacher. Mr. Zimmerman, I cannot pay you." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. He paused, looked at her again. Something shifted in those gray eyes, something almost like surprise that she would think payment mattered. "Did not ask you to." He set the first board down carefully, measuring it against the foundation stones that remained. "Just asked if you wanted your school back. She felt tears prick her eyes, the first she had allowed herself since the fire. "Yes, yes, I do." He nodded once, as if that settled everything, and went back to unloading the wagon. Natalie watched him work for several minutes, unsure of what to do. He moved with an efficiency that spoke of long experience, his hands sure and steady as he sorted the lumber and began laying out the foundation for the new walls. Finally, she stepped forward. "What can I do to help?" He glanced at her, taking in her borrowed dress and thin shoes. "You have work gloves." She shook her head. Without another word, he reached into the wagon and pulled out a pair of worn leather gloves. They were far too large for her hands, but she put them on anyway. "Hold this board steady while I nail it," he instructed. She did as he asked, and slowly, piece by piece, they began to build. The work was harder than anything Natalie had done in her life. Her hands blistered despite the gloves. Her back ached from bending and lifting. But there was something solid about it, something real. Each nail driven into wood was a small act of defiance against the fire that had tried to take everything from her. They worked until the light began to fade. Dalton, he had told her to call him Dalton after the third hour, when formality seemed absurd given that they were covered in sawdust, and Sweat stepped back to survey their progress. "Good start," he said. "I will come back tomorrow." "I will be here," Natalie promised. He nodded, climbed back onto his wagon, and drove away without another word. That night, back in the Patterson home, Natalie stared at her blistered palms and felt something she had not felt since the fire hope. Dalton returned the next morning just after dawn, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. Each day, he brought more supplies. Each day, he worked with the same quiet determination. And each day, Natalie worked beside him. Others from the town came to help when they could. The blacksmith donated nails. The sawmill owner provided additional lumber at cost. But it was Dalton who was there every single day from sunrise to sunset, building her world back one board at a time. "Why are you doing this?" she asked him one afternoon, about a week into the work. They were sitting on what would eventually be the school steps, eating the lunch Mrs. Patterson had packed for her. Dalton was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the hills. "Had a sister once," he finally said. "She loved learning, loved books. We did not have much schooling where we grew up in Missouri. She always said when she was grown she would be a teacher." "What happened to her?" Natalie asked softly. "Fever took her when she was 14. That was 12 years ago." He turned to look at Natalie, and she saw old grief in his eyes. "She would have been like you, I think, determined, brave enough to come west and teach children who had nothing." Natalie felt her throat tighten. "I am not brave, I am terrified." "Being brave does not mean you are not scared," he said. "It means you do it anyway." They sat in silence for a while, and Natalie found it was a comfortable silence, not awkward or strained. There was something steady about Dalton, something that made her feel anchored when everything else in her world had come loose. Over the next weeks, as winter slowly gave way to early spring, the school began to take shape. The walls went up. The roof went on. Windows were installed, donated by families who could barely afford them. Through it all, Dalton was there, and through it all, Natalie found herself watching him more than she probably should. She noticed the way he always made sure she ate lunch, sharing his own food when she had none. She noticed how he would take on the heaviest, most dangerous tasks without being asked, never expecting her to do more than she could manage. She noticed the small kindnesses, how he made sure she had a warm place to sit when the wind was cold. How he built the school steps a little lower than standard, because he had noticed she was not very tall. How he never made her feel weak or incapable, even though he could do in an hour what took her all day. "You are good at this," she said one afternoon, watching him fit a window frame with perfect precision. Done a lot of building, he said. Ranch does not run itself, always something that needs fixing or making. Is it lonely? The question came out before she could stop it. Living out there by yourself, his hand stilled on the frame. Sometimes, he admitted. Got used to it, though. Quiet suits me. I used to think I liked quiet too, Natalie said, but after the fire the quiet felt suffocating, like I was disappearing into it. He turned to look at her fully then, and she was struck by the intensity in his gaze. You are not disappearing. You are still here. You are still fighting. Because you helped me fight, she said softly. Something passed between them in that moment, something warm and vital that made Natalie's breath catch. But before either of them could speak again, Mayor Hendricks arrived with a donation of desks salvaged from a school in a neighboring town, and the moment passed, but it was not forgotten. As March arrived and the school neared completion, Natalie realized she was going to have to face another problem. She had a school but nowhere to live. The cabin that had stood beside the school was gone, and she could not impose on the Pattersons forever. I have been thinking, Mrs. Patterson said one evening over dinner. My sister in Little Rock has a boarding house. Perhaps you could write to her, see if there is work there, at least until you can save enough to build a new home here. The suggestion made sense. It was practical. But the thought of leaving Eureka Springs, of leaving the school she and Dalton had built together, filled Natalie with an ache she did not fully understand. I will consider it, she said, but she knew Mrs. Patterson heard the reluctance in her voice. The next day, she mentioned it to Dalton. They were painting the schoolroom walls white, and the smell of fresh paint mixed with the smell of new wood. Mrs. Patterson thinks I should go to Little Rock, she said, keeping her eyes on the wall she was painting. Find work there until I can afford to come back. Dalton's brush stopped moving. That what you want? No, she admitted, but I do not see another option. I cannot stay with the Pattersons indefinitely, and I have no money to build a cabin. Marry me. The words were so unexpected, so quietly spoken that at first Natalie thought she had misheard. She turned to stare at him, her paintbrush dripping white onto the floor. What? He set down his brush and turned to face her, his expression serious. Marry me. I have a house. It is not fancy, but it is solid. It has 2 bedrooms, a good kitchen, a well. You would have a home. You could stay and teach. Natalie's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts. Dalton, you cannot be serious. I am serious. He took a step closer and she saw no humor in his face, only earnest intensity. I know it is sudden. I know I am not much of a talker, but I have a good ranch. I can provide for you. You would not want for anything. But you do not love me, Natalie whispered, and I do not love you. Something flickered in his eyes at that, something that looked almost like pain, but his voice remained steady. Maybe not yet, but I respect you. I admire you. And I think you might be the finest woman I have ever known. That seems like a good start. Natalie's mind was reeling. Marriage had never been part of her plan. She had come west specifically to avoid the expectations placed on women in Boston, the assumption that marriage and motherhood were the only paths available. She had wanted to be her own person, make her own way. But she was also practical enough to recognize the truth of her situation. Without money, without family, without even a home, her options were severely limited. And there was something else, something she was almost afraid to acknowledge over the past weeks. She had come to care for Dalton. She looked forward to seeing him each morning. She felt safer when he was near. The thought of leaving and never seeing him again made her chest ache. Can I think about it? She asked quietly. Of course. He picked up his brush again, turning back to the wall as if he had just asked about the weather. Take all the time you need. But his hands, she noticed, were not quite steady. That night, Natalie lay awake trying to make sense of her feelings. She was not a romantic. She had never dreamed of a knight in shining armor or a grand, passionate love. She believed in practical things, in hard work and self-sufficiency. But she also believed in kindness, and Dalton Zimmerman was the kindest man she had ever met. He had rebuilt her world board by board, nail by nail, asking nothing in return. He had shown her through actions rather than words that she was worth helping, worth saving. And somewhere in the process, she had begun to fall for him. Was that love? She did not know. But maybe, as he had said, it was a start. 3 days later, she gave him her answer. They were finishing the last of the work on the school, hanging a new bell above the door. Dalton was on the ladder, and Natalie was holding it steady when she said, "Yes." He looked down at her, his expression carefully neutral. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." For a moment, he just stared at her. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. It transformed him, made him look younger, almost boyish. Natalie realized it was the first time she had seen him truly smile, and it took her breath away. He climbed down the ladder, stood in front of her. "You are certain?" "I am certain," she said, and found that she meant it. He reached out, gently took her hand. His palm was calloused and rough, but his touch was gentle. "I will do everything I can to make you happy, Natalie. I promise you that." "I know you will," she said softly. "You already have." They were married the following Sunday in the new church, with most of the town in attendance. Natalie wore a dress donated by the seamstress, pale blue with white lace at the collar. Dalton wore his only suit, brushed clean and pressed. He had gotten a haircut and shaved, and Natalie found herself staring at him as they stood at the altar, wondering how she had never noticed how handsome he was. When the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," Dalton leaned in carefully, as if afraid she might break, and pressed his lips softly to hers. It was Natalie's first kiss, and it was gentle and sweet and full of promise. After the ceremony, there was a small celebration at the town hall. Someone brought out a fiddle. There was dancing and food and laughter. Dalton danced with Natalie once, holding her carefully, moving with surprising grace for such a large man. "You are a good dancer," she said, surprised. "My mother insisted all her children learn," he said. "Said it was the mark of civilized people." "Tell me about your family," Natalie asked. She realized she knew so little about him. "Not much to tell. Parents are gone now. Lost my father to the war, my mother a few years after. Had 3 brothers and my sister. Brothers all went their own ways after Ma died. Have not seen them in years." "Do you miss them?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I learned a long time ago that missing something does not bring it back. Better to focus on what is right in front of you." He looked at her as he said it, and Natalie felt warmth spread through her chest. As the sun set, Dalton loaded her few borrowed possessions into his wagon and helped her up onto the seat. The ride to his ranch took about an hour, winding through the Ozark Hills on rutted roads. Natalie had never been nervous around Dalton before, but now, as his wife heading to his home, she felt butterflies in her stomach. "Are you scared?" he asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "A little," she admitted. "We do not have to rush anything," he said. "I meant what I said. I want you to be happy. That means you get to decide the pace of things." She looked at him, saw the sincerity in his profile. "Thank you." His ranch, when they arrived, was more impressive than she had expected. The house was solid timber, well built, with a wide porch and real glass windows. There was a barn, a chicken coop, corrals for the horses and cattle. Everything was neat and well maintained. "It is beautiful," she said honestly. "It is home," he said simply. He carried her over the threshold, which made her laugh despite her nerves. Inside, the house was clean and spare but comfortable. There was a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen with a good stove and 2 bedrooms, just as he had said. "That one is yours," he said, pointing to the larger of the 2 bedrooms. "I will take the smaller one." "I put fresh linens on the bed this morning." Natalie turned to him. "Dalton, we are married. You do not have to sleep in another room." "I know," he said quietly. "But I meant it when I said we do not have to rush. I want you to feel comfortable here. I want you to trust me." Looking at him, at this good, patient man who had rebuilt her world, Natalie made a decision. She stepped forward and took his hand. "I do trust you," she said. "And I do not want you to sleep alone in another room like we are strangers. We may not be in love yet, but we are married. We are partners, and partners do not make each other sleep alone." Something lit in his eyes then, something warm and grateful and maybe a little bit eager. "Are you certain?" "I am certain." He lifted her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles gently. "Then I am the luckiest man in Arkansas." That night, they shared a bed for the first time. Dalton was gentle and patient, taking his time, making sure she was comfortable. Afterward, lying in his arms, Natalie felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where she was supposed to be, with this man in this place, building this life. "No regrets?" he asked softly, his breath warm against her hair. "No regrets," she whispered back. "You?" "None." He tightened his arms around her. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Natalie Zimmerman." She smiled at the sound of her new name. "I think you might be the best thing that ever happened to me, too." The next weeks fell into a rhythm. Natalie reopened the school and her students returned, excited to see their new building. She taught them every weekday, pouring her heart into their education. In the evenings, she would ride back to the ranch with Dalton, who made a point of coming to town each afternoon to escort her home. At the ranch, they settled into married life. Natalie learned to cook on the big stove, experimenting with recipes. Dalton taught her to ride properly, patiently guiding her until she felt confident on horseback. They worked together in the garden he helped her plant behind the house. They talked in the evenings, really talked, sharing stories and dreams and fears. And slowly, the thing that had started as a practical arrangement began to transform into something deeper. Natalie found herself watching for Dalton throughout the day, her heart lifting when she saw his wagon approaching the school. She loved the way he listened when she talked about her students, genuinely interested in their progress. She loved how he never made her feel foolish for not knowing ranch things, teaching her with patience and good humor. She loved the way he looked at her, like she was precious and remarkable. And Dalton, for his part, seemed to blossom under her attention. He smiled more. He talked more. He even started accepting invitations to town socials, standing proudly beside her as she chatted with neighbors. The lonely, quiet cowboy was becoming part of the community, and Natalie knew it was because he wanted to be part of her world. One evening in May, after they had been married for about 2 months, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. Dalton had his arm around her shoulders and she was leaning into his warmth. "I love you," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the words. He went very still beside her. "Natalie." "I do," she said, turning to look up at him. "I did not expect to. I thought we would have a comfortable partnership, maybe eventually become fond of each other. But it is more than that. You are more than that. You have shown me what it means to be truly cared for. You have given me back my purpose, my home, my sense of self. And somewhere along the way, I fell completely in love with you." She saw his eyes glisten in the fading light. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch reverent. "I have loved you since the day I saw you standing in the ruins of your school, refusing to give up. I built that school hoping it would give me an excuse to be near you. I asked you to marry me because I could not bear the thought of you leaving. Every day since has been a gift I never thought I would deserve. You deserve everything good in this world," she said fiercely. You are the best man I have ever known." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, pouring all his feeling into it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I am going to spend the rest of my life making you happy," he promised. "You already do," she whispered back. As spring turned to summer, their love continued to grow. Dalton surprised her with small gifts, wildflowers he picked on his rides, a new book ordered from St. Louis, a rocking chair he built for the porch. Natalie surprised him too, learning to make his favorite foods, mending his clothes with careful stitches, helping him with the ranch work even though she still was not very good at it. In July, Natalie realized she was pregnant. She was terrified to tell Dalton at first, unsure how he would react. But when she finally worked up the courage one evening after dinner, his response was everything she could have hoped for. "A baby," he breathed, his hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," she said, watching his face anxiously. "Are you happy?" "Happy." He laughed, the sound bright and unrestrained. "Natalie, I am beyond happy. I am overwhelmed. I am terrified. I am thrilled. A baby, our baby." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. She felt his heart pounding against her cheek. "I am scared," she admitted. "What if something goes wrong? What if I am not a good mother?" "You are going to be an amazing mother," he said firmly. "You are patient and kind and smart, and whatever happens, whatever comes, we will face it together. You are not alone anymore, Natalie. You will never be alone again." She clung to him, letting his strength anchor her. "I love you so much." "I love you too," he murmured, "more than I have words for." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into fall. Natalie continued teaching until October, when her growing belly made it impractical to stand at the chalkboard all day. The town hired a temporary teacher to take over until after the baby was born, and Natalie spent her days at the ranch, preparing for the child's arrival. Dalton was endlessly solicitous, always making sure she was comfortable, never letting her do anything too strenuous. He converted the smaller bedroom into a nursery, building a beautiful cradle by hand. He painted the walls a cheerful yellow and installed shelves for the baby things that neighbors began donating. "You want a boy or a girl?" Natalie asked him one afternoon, watching him sand the cradle smooth. "Healthy," he said immediately. "That is all I want. A healthy baby and a healthy wife." "But if you could choose," he considered. "A boy, I suppose, someone to teach ranching to pass the land on to, but a girl would be wonderful too, especially if she is anything like her mother." Natalie smiled. "I hope they are like you. Strong and kind and good." "I hope they are like both of us," he said. "The best parts of us." In late February, almost exactly a year after the fire that had destroyed her old life, Natalie went into labor. Dalton rode hard to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Larson, and then paced the house like a caged animal while Natalie labored in their bedroom. It was a long, difficult birth. Natalie had never experienced pain like it, waves of agony that seemed to go on forever. But every time she felt like she could not endure another moment, she heard Dalton's voice through the door, talking to her, encouraging her, loving her. It gave her strength. Finally, as dawn broke on a cold February morning, their son was born. He came into the world squalling, his little face red and furious. Mrs. Larson cleaned him up and wrapped him in a blanket, then placed him in Natalie's arms. "You can let the father in now," she said with a smile. Dalton came through the door like a storm, his eyes immediately finding Natalie. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," she said, exhausted but happy. "Come meet your son." He approached slowly, almost reverently, staring down at the tiny bundle in her arms. "He is so small." "He is perfect," Natalie said. "Look at his eyes, they are just like yours." Dalton reached out a tentative finger, and the baby immediately grabbed it with a surprisingly strong grip. Something melted in Dalton's expression, pure love and wonder transforming his face. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I am your father, and I promise I am going to do everything I can to give you a good life." "What should we name him?" Natalie asked. They had discussed names but never settled on anything. Now, looking at their son, Natalie knew exactly what felt right. "What about Michael?" she suggested. "After my father." "Michael Zimmerman." "Michael," Dalton repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Michael Zimmerman. Welcome to the world, son." The baby blinked up at them with unfocused eyes, and Natalie felt her heart overflow with love. This tiny person, made from her and Dalton, was the culmination of everything they had built together. He was hope made flesh, proof that beautiful things could grow from ashes. The first months of Michael's life were exhausting and wonderful. Natalie had never been so tired in her life, but she had also never been so happy. Dalton was an excellent father, always willing to walk with a crying baby in the middle of the night, to change diapers, to do whatever was needed. They worked as a team, supporting each other through the challenges of new parenthood. In May, when Michael was 3 months old, Natalie felt ready to return to teaching. Dalton's mother had left behind a cradle that could be rocked with a foot pedal, and they set it up in the schoolhouse. Michael would sleep or play in his cradle while Natalie taught, and the students adored having a baby in the classroom. "Is this how you imagined your life would be?" Dalton asked her one evening. They were on the porch, watching the sunset while Michael nursed. "A year ago, you had lost everything. Now look at you." Natalie looked around at the ranch that had become her home, at the baby in her arms, at the man beside her. "I could never have imagined this. It is so much better than anything I could have planned. No regrets about leaving Boston, about the independent life you wanted." "I am independent," she said. "I still teach, I still make my own choices, but I am not alone anymore, and I think that is better. We are better together than we could ever be apart." He kissed her temple. "We are indeed." As Michael grew, he became the center of their world. He was a happy baby, always smiling, always curious. He had Dalton's gray eyes and Natalie's brown hair. He had his father's quiet temperament but his mother's determination. On Michael's first birthday, they threw a party at the ranch. Half the town came to celebrate. There was food and music and laughter. Watching Dalton play with their son, tossing him in the air and catching him while Michael shrieked with delight, Natalie felt profound gratitude for the turns her life had taken. Mrs. Patterson found her in the kitchen, cutting cake. "You look happy, dear." "I am," Natalie said simply. "Happier than I have ever been." "When you first came to Eureka Springs, I worried about you," Mrs. Patterson said. "You seemed so alone, so determined to prove you did not need anyone. And then the fire, I thought you might give up, but you did not. You rebuilt. And you found love in the process." "Dalton rebuilt me," Natalie said. "He gave me back everything I had lost and so much more." "You rebuilt each other," Mrs. Patterson corrected gently. "That man was a ghost before you came into his life. Now look at him." Natalie looked out the window to where Dalton was teaching some of the older boys how to rope a fence post. He was laughing, completely at ease, surrounded by community. Mrs. Patterson was right. He had changed too. They had saved each other. When Michael was 2, Natalie became pregnant again. This time, she was less terrified, more confident. She knew what to expect. She knew Dalton would be there for her. She knew they could handle whatever came. Their daughter, Sarah, was born in October of 1879, 3 years after Natalie and Dalton's wedding. She was smaller than Michael had been, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to shift between blue and gray. From the moment she was born, she had Dalton wrapped around her tiny finger. "I never knew I could love something this much," he said, holding Sarah while she slept. "Between you, Michael, and her, my heart is so full it might burst." "Mine too," Natalie said softly. Life continued to be full and busy. Natalie taught school, though she reduced her hours to spend more time with the children. Dalton's ranch prospered. They added to the house, building more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. They saved money carefully, always mindful of how quickly everything could be lost. But the fear Natalie had felt after the fire gradually faded. She realized that home was not a building or possessions. Home was the people you loved, the life you built together. Even if another fire came, even if disaster struck again, she would not truly lose everything. Not as long as she had Dalton and their children. When Sarah was 3 and Michael was 5, Natalie became pregnant for the 3rd time. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2. She was often sick and tired. But Dalton was there every step of the way, taking on more of the household work, caring for the children when she needed to rest. Their 3rd child, a son they named Daniel, was born in May of 1882. He came quickly, much faster than his siblings, arriving before the midwife could even get to the ranch. Dalton delivered him himself, his hands shaking but steady, and when he placed the baby in Natalie's arms, there were tears streaming down his face. 3, he said in wonder. "We have 3 children." "We do," Natalie said, marveling at it. "We have built quite a family." "I love you," he said, kissing her forehead. "I love you so much, Natalie. Thank you for giving me all of this." "Thank you for rebuilding my world," she whispered back. As the children grew, the house was always full of noise and laughter. Michael was serious and responsible, already showing an interest in ranching. Sarah was wild and imaginative, always getting into mischief. Daniel was the baby, sweet and cuddly, beloved by everyone. Natalie continued teaching, though she eventually reduced her schedule to just 3 days a week. The rest of the time she spent at the ranch, working alongside Dalton, raising their children, building the life they had created together. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Dalton surprised her with a gift. He led her outside to where a brand new building stood beside the house. It was small but beautiful, with large windows and shelves lining the walls. "What is this?" she asked, confused. "Your library," he said. "You lost all your books in the fire. I thought it was time you started building a collection again." She walked inside, marveling at the craftsmanship. There was a comfortable chair by the window, a desk, even a small fireplace to keep it warm in winter. "Dalton, this is too much." "It is not nearly enough," he said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "You gave up so much when you married me. You could have gone anywhere, done anything. But you stayed here. You chose this life. You chose me. The least I can do is give you a place to pursue your love of reading." She turned in his arms, looking up at him. His face had weathered over the years, lines forming around his eyes and mouth. His hair was starting to gray at the temples. But to her, he was more handsome now than he had been the day they married. "I do not regret a single choice I made," she said fiercely. "Choosing you was the best decision of my life." He kissed her then, long and deep, the kiss of 2 people who knew each other completely, who had built a life together from nothing, who had loved each other through joy and hardship and everything in between. "I love you, Mrs. Zimmerman," he murmured against her lips. "I love you too, Mr. Zimmerman," she murmured back. Over the next years, the library filled with books. Dalton ordered them from catalogs, bought them on trips to larger towns, even traded cattle for rare volumes. Natalie would spend her free time there, reading, studying, preparing lessons for her students. Sometimes the children would join her, and she would read aloud while they played quietly on the floor. Michael grew into a capable young man, working the ranch alongside his father. Sarah became a skilled rider, able to outride most of the boys in town. Daniel showed an early love of books, spending hours in Natalie's library, reading everything he could get his hands on. When Michael was 16, he asked Dalton if he could start courting Mary Henderson, the daughter of a neighboring rancher. Dalton gave his permission, but not before having a long conversation about respect and responsibility. Natalie watched from the porch as father and son talked, seeing so much of Dalton in Michael's serious expression. "He is a good boy," she said when Dalton joined her later. "He is," Dalton agreed. "We did well with him, with all of them." "We did," she said. "Though I think you deserve most of the credit. You taught them what it means to be good, hard-working, kind people." "I just showed them what you showed me," he said quietly. "Before you, I was barely living. I went through the motions, worked the ranch, existed, but I did not live. You taught me how to do that. You taught me that life is more than just surviving. It is about building something beautiful, creating something meaningful, and that is what we have done." Natalie leaned into him, comfortable and content. They sat together as the sun set, watching the Ozark Hills turn gold and red in the fading light. The life they had built spread out around them, the ranch, the children, the love that bound it all together. "You ever think about the fire?" Dalton asked quietly. "About what you lost?" "Sometimes," Natalie admitted, "but not with sadness anymore. That fire cleared away my old life to make room for this one. If it had not happened, I might never have truly known you. I might never have let myself depend on anyone. I might have stayed lonely and isolated, convinced that independence meant being alone." "I am glad the fire brought us together," Dalton said, "though I wish you had not had to suffer through it." "All of it was worth it to get here," she said simply. "Every moment of pain, every moment of fear, every moment of doubt, it was all worth it to have this life with you." He pulled her closer, kissed the top of her head. "You are the love of my life, Natalie Zimmerman, the best thing that ever happened to me. And I thank God every day for the morning I decided to load up my wagon with lumber and drive into town." "Best decision you ever made," she teased. "Second best," he corrected. "The best was asking you to marry me." She laughed, tilting her face up for his kiss. As the years continued to pass, their family grew and changed. Michael married Mary Henderson when he was 20, and they built a house on the far side of Dalton's land. 2 years later, they had a daughter, making Natalie and Dalton grandparents. Sarah married at 19, choosing a young teacher who had come to Eureka Springs. They moved to Little Rock, where he had been offered a position at a larger school. Daniel went to college in St. Louis, studying literature, the first in their family to pursue higher education. Through it all, Dalton and Natalie remained the center, the foundation. Their love had not dimmed with time but deepened, becoming something solid and unshakable. They knew each other's rhythms, could communicate with a glance, finished each other's sentences. They still held hands on the porch in the evenings. They still kissed each other goodbye and hello. They still told each other, "I love you," every single day. On their 20th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch. Michael and Mary were there with their 3 children now. Sarah had come from Little Rock with her husband and 2 daughters. Daniel had brought his new wife, a fellow student he had met at college. The house was full to bursting with people and noise and love. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, Natalie and Dalton walked out to the bluff overlooking the valley. The stars were bright overhead, the air cool and clean. They stood together, his arm around her shoulders, looking out at the land they had built their life on. 20 years, Natalie said softly. "Can you believe it? Some days it feels like we just met," Dalton said. "Other days it feels like we have been together forever, like I cannot remember a time when you were not part of me." I cannot remember who I was before you, Natalie admitted. That woman who came to Eureka Springs alone, determined to prove she did not need anyone. She feels like a stranger now. She was brave, Dalton said. She was strong and determined and fierce, but she was also lonely and scared. I am glad she let me in. I am glad she let me love her. I am glad too, Natalie said. You rebuilt my world, Dalton. One day at a time, one board at a time, one moment of kindness at a time. You took a woman who had lost everything and gave her more than she ever dreamed of having. We rebuilt each other, he said, echoing Mrs. Patterson's words from so many years ago. I was just going through the motions before you, existing but not living. You gave me purpose. You gave me love. You gave me a family. You gave me a reason to wake up each morning with joy instead of just duty. She turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. Even in the starlight, she could see the love in his eyes, as bright and strong as it had been on their wedding day. Maybe even stronger now, deepened by 20 years of shared life, of weathering storms together, of building something beautiful from ashes. I love you, Dalton Zimmerman, she said. I loved you when you first pulled up in that wagon full of lumber. I loved you when you asked me to marry you. I loved you when you held our first child. I loved you through every moment of the past 20 years, and I will love you for every moment we have left. I love you, Natalie, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You are my heart, my home, my everything. And I will spend every day I have left showing you how much you mean to me. They kissed under the stars, two people who had found each other in the rubble and built something extraordinary. Around them, the ranch slept peacefully, their children, their grandchildren, the physical evidence of the life they had created together. The schoolhouse in town still stood, rebuilt from the ashes of the fire. A new generation of children learned their letters and numbers there now, taught by a young woman Natalie had mentored. But everyone in Eureka Springs still remembered Miss Natalie Morgan, who had refused to give up when she lost everything, and the quiet cowboy who had loved her enough to rebuild her world. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Natalie looked up at Dalton and smiled. Do you remember what you said to me that first day? When you brought the lumber, I asked if you wanted your school back, he said. You gave me so much more than the school, she said. You gave me everything. You gave me everything too, he said softly. Everything that matters. They went inside, climbing into the bed they had shared for 20 years, holding each other close. Outside, the wind whispered through the Ozark Hills, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow. Inside, two hearts beat in rhythm, two souls intertwined, two lives merged into one. The fire had taken everything from Natalie Morgan. But from those ashes, Dalton Zimmerman had helped her build something far more precious than what she had lost. They had built a life, a love, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And every morning when Natalie woke in Dalton's arms, every evening when they sat together on the porch, every moment they spent with their family, she was reminded of the fundamental truth that had shaped her life. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what you really need. She had needed Dalton, though she had not known it at the time. She had needed his quiet strength, his patient kindness, his unwavering love. She had needed to learn that depending on someone did not make you weak, it made you human. She had needed to understand that the greatest independence came not from standing alone, but from choosing to stand beside someone who made you better. And Dalton had needed her just as much. He had needed her fierce determination, her refusal to give up, her capacity for joy despite hardship. He had needed someone to live for, to build for, to love with all the intensity he had kept locked inside for so many years. They had saved each other, rebuilt each other, loved each other through everything life threw at them. The years continued to pass gently. Dalton's hair turned fully gray, then white. Natalie's face gained more lines, her hands becoming arthritic. But they aged together, growing old side by side, still holding hands, still stealing kisses, still very much in love. When Dalton was 63 and Natalie 58, they decided to officially retire. Michael took over running the ranch, having proven himself more than capable. Natalie trained her replacement at the school, a young woman named Emma who reminded her very much of herself at that age. "Promise me you will not work so hard you forget to live," Natalie told Emma on her last day of teaching. "I promise, Mrs. Zimmerman," Emma said, "and thank you for everything you have taught this town's children, for everything you have shown us about strength and perseverance." Natalie hugged her, feeling the weight of 40 years of teaching lift from her shoulders. It was time. Time to rest, to enjoy the family she and Dalton had built, to spend their remaining years in simple contentment. They traveled a bit, taking a train to St. Louis to visit Daniel, going to Little Rock to see Sarah. But mostly they stayed at the ranch, surrounded by grandchildren and great-grandchildren, watching their legacy grow and flourish. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered once again. There were dozens of people now, spanning 4 generations. The house could not hold everyone, so they set up tables outside under the trees. There was music and dancing and so much laughter. Dalton stood to make a toast, his voice still strong despite his years. 40 years ago, I married the most remarkable woman I had ever met. She had just lost everything to a fire, but she refused to be broken. She stood in those ruins and decided to rebuild. And somehow, for reasons I still do not fully understand, she let me help her. She let me into her life. She let me love her. And in doing so, she gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. She gave me a reason to truly live. Everything you see here, everyone you see here, exists because Natalie said yes when I asked her to be my wife. I love you, Natalie Zimmerman. Today, tomorrow, and for whatever time we have left. There was not a dry eye at the tables. Natalie stood, tears streaming down her face, and kissed her husband deeply. The family erupted in cheers and applause. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips, "always and forever." They danced that night under the stars, just as they had at their wedding 40 years before. They moved slower now, their bodies not as spry as they once were, but the love was the same, constant, unwavering, true. Dalton lived to see his 72nd birthday, still strong and sharp until the very end. He died peacefully in his sleep one warm June night, Natalie held in his arms. She woke to find him gone, his face peaceful, his hand still holding hers. The grief was overwhelming. After 47 years together, the loss felt like losing part of herself. But even in her sorrow, Natalie was grateful. Grateful for every moment they had shared. Grateful that he had not suffered. Grateful for the life they had built together. She lived another 3 years after Dalton passed, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She spent her days in the library he had built for her, reading and writing letters and telling stories about Dalton to anyone who would listen. She wanted to make sure his grandchildren knew what an extraordinary man he had been. On a cool February morning, exactly 50 years after the fire that had destroyed her first school, Natalie Morgan Zimmerman passed away quietly in her sleep. She was 76 years old. When her children came to check on her, they found her in her favorite chair by the library window, a peaceful smile on her face, a book of poetry in her lap. They buried her beside Dalton on the bluff overlooking the valley, the place where they had stood on so many evenings watching the sunset. The entire town came to the funeral, as well as former students who traveled from across the state. Person after person stood to speak about how Natalie had touched their lives, how she had taught them not just reading and arithmetic, but resilience and hope. But it was Michael who spoke the most moving words. "My mother lost everything once, but she did not let that loss define her. With my father's help, she rebuilt. And in rebuilding, she created something more beautiful than what she had lost. She taught us that home is not a place, it is people. That love is not about grand gestures but daily kindness. That the greatest strength is not in standing alone, but in choosing to stand beside someone who makes you better." My parents loved each other deeply for almost 50 years. They showed us what real partnership looks like, what true devotion means. And because of their love, we are all here. Multiple generations, all existing because a quiet cowboy saw a woman who needed help and decided to bring her some lumber. It was a perfect epitaph for a perfect love story. Years later, when Michael's granddaughter was assigned to write an essay about Arkansas history, she chose to write about Natalie Morgan Zimmerman, the schoolteacher who had taught in Eureka Springs for 4 decades. She interviewed elderly former students, pored through town records, and listened to family stories. The essay won first place in the state competition. In it, the granddaughter wrote, "My great-grandmother lost everything in a fire. But from those ashes, she and my great-grandfather built an extraordinary life. They proved that the worst thing that happens to you does not have to be the end of your story. Sometimes it is just the beginning. Sometimes losing everything is how you find what truly matters." The old schoolhouse still stood in Eureka Springs, rebuilt and expanded over the years but still recognizable. Inside, on a brass plaque, were the words, "Built 1876, dedicated to Natalie Morgan Zimmerman, who taught us that courage means rebuilding when everything falls apart." And outside, in the small cemetery on the bluff, 2 headstones stood side by side, weathered by time but still legible. On one was written, "Dalton Zimmerman, 1847–1919. Beloved husband, father, and friend. He rebuilt worlds." On the other, "Natalie Morgan Zimmerman, 1853–1926. Beloved wife, mother, and teacher. She rebuilt lives." Between the 2 headstones, someone had planted a rosebush that bloomed year after year, its flowers a deep red that looked almost like flames. But these flames did not destroy. They celebrated. They remembered. They honored a love that had grown from ashes and flourished beyond all measure. The story of the schoolteacher who lost everything and the quiet cowboy who rebuilt her world became legend in Eureka Springs. It was told and retold, passed down through generations, a reminder that even in the darkest moments hope can be found. That kindness can change lives. That love, real and true and patient, can build something extraordinary from nothing. And on warm summer evenings when the wind whispered through the Ozark Hills, some people swore they could still see 2 figures standing on the bluff, holding hands, watching the sunset together, just as they had for so many years, just as, perhaps, they would for all eternity. Because some loves are too strong to be contained by mortal life. Some loves echo through time, inspiring and uplifting everyone they touch. The love between Natalie Morgan and Dalton Zimmerman was such a love. It had started with a wagon full of lumber and a quiet question. It had grown through patience and kindness and daily choice. It had flourished into something beautiful and lasting, a legacy that would endure long after they were both gone. And in the end, that was the truest rebuilding of all. Not the school, not the house, not the ranch, but the love they had built together, board by board, day by day, moment by moment. A love that had started in ashes and grown into something eternal. A love that proved, beyond any doubt, that the quiet cowboy had indeed rebuilt the schoolteacher's world, and in doing so had built something far more precious than either of them could have imagined. they had built forever.